The wind howled across the vast prairie as the sun dipped low behind the jagged horizon, painting the sky in a desperate blend of orange, crimson, and fading gold. And in the middle of that lonely expanse, a cowboy named Luke rode his weary stallion with a woman clutched tightly in his arms, her breath shallow, her eyes heavy with pain, her voice a trembling whisper that broke against the weight of the silence as she begged, "Please don't leave me here." And though her words were frail, they carried the weight of survival, of desperation, of a soul clinging to the thinnest thread of hope. And Luke, hardened by years of solitude, of storms, of losing too much in this unforgiving land, felt something stir inside him that had long been buried, a sense of duty greater than the law of men, greater than the law of guns, greater even than the cruel call of the frontier, and he tightened his grip around her fragile frame, spurring his horse forward, refusing to look back at the smoke rising in the distance from the town they had just escaped. A town poisoned by greed, violence, and betrayal. A town that had turned its back on innocence and left this woman, Clara, to the wolves. But Luke wasn't about to abandon her the way the world had. Not tonight. Not while she still breathed. And while his heart still beat in rhythm with the pounding hooves beneath him. And as the prairie stretched endlessly before them, memories burned inside his skull like embers refusing to die. Memories of how it all began only hours earlier when the evening sun still clung high and the world felt deceptively calm. For Luke had been riding into that town with no greater ambition than to trade his cattle, collect his pay, and ride out again before nightfall. Yet fate had other plans. Fate in the form of a trembling voice that cried for help in an alley where men of foul intent cornered a woman with eyes, too kind for such cruelty. And though Luke had promised himself long ago never to get involved, never to let someone else's trouble become his own, the moment he saw Clara's tear-streaked face and the way her hands trembled as she clutched her torn dress, something inside him broke. And with a speed that surprised even himself, his hand went to the revolver at his hip, his voice a thunder that echoed down the alley as he barked, "Let her go!" And the men, cowards though they were, sneered at first, until they recognized the sharp steel in Luke's gaze, the kind of gaze that belonged to someone who had walked through fire and lived to tell about it, someone who had buried brothers and seen graves, too shallow for the tears shed upon them. And in that instant steel sang, fire roared, bullets flew, and when the dust settled the men lay scattered, their shadows feeding the ground, and Luke stood there, revolver smoking, heart thundering, Clara trembling against the wall as if the earth itself had shaken, and though she tried to speak, her voice collapsed under the weight of gratitude and fear, and all she managed was a whisper, why would you do this for me?" And Luke, ever the cowboy who had no use for words when silence spoke truer, simply offered her his hand and said, "Because someone had to," and with those words a bond was forged. In fire and blood, a bond neither expected, a bond that would be tested before the night was through. For no good deed went unpunished in those parts. And soon the sound of boots echoed, lawman or worse, and Luke knew the town would never forgive him for standing up against men who carried influence as heavy as their guns. So he told Clara to run with him, to trust him. And though fear clung to her like a second skin, she nodded, clutching his hand as they ran through shadows, through back streets, through firelight spilling from saloons where laughter rang too false and music hid the stench of corruption. And then they reached his horse, and with a lift of his strong arms she was mounted before him, her breath ragged, her heart hammering as he leapt up behind her, spurring the stallion into the wild, into freedom, into the unknown. And the chase began, bullets snapping through the air, voices shouting their names, curses hurled into the night. But Luke did not falter, his eyes fixed on the prairie ahead, that endless sea of grass that promised either life or death, but never mercy. And Clara clung to him, whispering once more, "Please don't leave me here." And Luke, whose life had been nothing but leaving and being left, felt those words carve into his soul, reminding him that even the loneliest heart yearned for something more, And so he swore silently that no matter what it cost, he would see her safe. He would carry her across this prairie, even if it meant bleeding out beneath the stars. And with every mile the night grew colder, the wind crueler, and Clara's strength weaker, her head lolling against his chest, as she drifted between consciousness and shadows. And Luke, though hardened by years of storms, felt panic gnaw at him like a beast, urging him forward faster, harder, until the horizon blurred and the stars blinked awake overhead, silent witnesses to this desperate flight. And as he rode, he remembered his own past, the woman he had once failed to save, the sister who had cried for him when he was too late, the promises broken by his own hesitation. And he whispered into Clara's ear, though she barely heard, "I won't fail you." "Not you." And somewhere deep inside she stirred, her fragile fingers clutching at his shirt as if she believed him. And that belief lit a fire stronger than any bullet could extinguish, carrying him across the prairie, away from the sins of men, toward whatever destiny waited in the darkness. And for those of you listening now, feeling the thunder of hooves in your chest, the ache of her whispered plea in your heart, remember that stories like these live on only when you breathe life into them, when you carry them forward. So if this tale has gripped your soul, if you, too, have felt the weight of her words, please don't leave me here. Then stay with us, subscribe to this channel, and ride alongside Luke and Clara into the next chapter. Because the prairie is wide, the night is long, and their story has only just begun. The prairie stretched on like a merciless ocean of grass, rolling in endless waves under a moonlit sky. And as Luke rode with Clara pressed against his chest, her faint breaths warming the leather of his vest, he felt the weight of her life in his arms, heavier than any saddlebag or rifle he had ever carried, a weight that was more than flesh and bone. It was the burden of her trust, the fragile thread of her plea, "Please don't leave me here," echoing over and over in his mind as if the night itself demanded he remember. And though his stallion's hooves beat steady against the earth, though the cool wind bit at his skin, he knew time was running out, for behind them still lingered the smoke of that town, the fire of vengeance, and the shadows of men who would not forget. Men who would ride into the night with rifles and hatred, because Luke had done what none dared. He had stood up against the powers that ruled by fear, and such defiance could not be forgiven. Not in the West, where blood bought silence and cruelty wore a sheriff's badge. So he pushed his horse harder, the animal's muscles straining, sweat glistening beneath the moon, until at last he reached the cover of a grove of cottonwoods that whispered in the night like ghosts, and there he dismounted, cradling Clara in his arms as he lowered her gently to the ground, her face pale, her lips trembling, and when her eyes fluttered open she whispered, "Luke, are we safe?" And though his instinct was to answer with the truth that no one was ever safe in a land where greed ruled sharper than steel, he instead brushed a strand of hair from her face and said softly, "Safer than we were, and safer than we'll be if we keep moving." For he knew words could be as powerful as bullets, and right now she needed the kind of hope that gave her strength to fight the darkness clawing at her body. And she smiled faintly, clutching at his hand with fingers cold as winter. And he felt something ignite in his chest, something fierce, something protective, something dangerously close to love, but he pushed it down. For a cowboy's life was not made for love. It was made for roads without end, for horizons without homes. And yet as he held her fragile hand, he wondered if perhaps this woman, this survivor who had begged not to be left behind, was different. If perhaps she could be the light his weary soul had long forgotten. And when she whispered, "Promise me you won't let them take me back," his voice was steady, unshakable. "I promise." And promises on the prairie were more sacred than church vows, more binding than contracts, for they were carved in blood and bone, and once made, they could never be broken without breaking the man himself. So Luke rose, again lifted her with care, and set her across the saddle before climbing up behind her. And once more they rode into the vast unknown, the stars watching, the prairie singing with the low rustle of grass, and behind them, somewhere in the darkness, came the faint echo of riders, too distant yet to threaten, but close enough to remind Luke that the night would not end in peace, and his hand went to the revolver at his side, cold steel pressing against his palm, a familiar comfort in a world where trust was rare. And as Clara leaned against him, half asleep, half clinging to consciousness, he whispered, "Hold on, Clara, just hold on," and she murmured, "I'm not afraid, not if you're here." And though those words cut deeper than any blade, Luke said nothing, for to speak would have been to admit how much they meant, and so he rode in silence. A silence broken only by the rhythm of hooves, the cry of night birds, and the faint pulse of her heartbeat against his chest. And as dawn's first light bled across the sky, painting the horizon in silver and rose, Luke saw in the distance the faint outline of an abandoned homestead, a place forgotten by men, swallowed by weeds and time. But to him it was a sanctuary, if only for a moment. So he turned his horse toward it, riding fast until the sagging fence posts loomed before him, the cracked windows staring like hollow eyes. And there he stopped, dismounted, and carried Clara inside, laying her on a bed of straw, softened by old quilts, her body trembling as if the cold of night had settled deep into her bones. And Luke, unskilled in the ways of healing, did what he could, stoking a fire in the rusted stove, wrapping her in his coat, whispering words he did not even recognize as his own, words of comfort, words of strength, words that promised she was not alone, not anymore. And as the warmth spread, she opened her eyes once more, staring at him as though he were the last star in a dark sky. And she whispered, "Luke, why me? Why save me?" And his jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with memories too painful to speak. But at last he answered, "Because once someone begged me not to leave, and I failed them. I won't fail again." And tears slipped down Clara's cheeks, not of sorrow, but of something brighter, something that glimmered in the broken light of that ruined home. And Luke, though he had sworn never to feel again, felt his chest ache with the weight of something new, something dangerous, yet something that made the endless prairie feel less empty. And when she drifted into sleep, her hand still clutching his, he sat beside her, revolver resting on his knee, eyes fixed on the horizon, for he knew the men who hunted them would not stop. Not until they dragged Clara back to the fate she had begged to escape. But he was ready. Ready to stand, ready to fight, ready to bleed if that's what it took. Because he had given his word. And a cowboy's word was all he truly owned. And so the night passed, dawn grew, and the sound of hooves approached once more. And Luke rose, steady as the land itself, whispering to Clara's sleeping form, "Rest easy, darling. I'll keep you safe." And then he stepped outside into the morning sun, revolver drawn, facing the dust clouds that rose with the riders, and the prairie held its breath, waiting to see if one man's promise could stand against the cruelty of many, waiting to see if love, fragile and unspoken, could survive the fire of hatred. And as Luke squared his shoulders, the story of that night grew larger than life, a story of a cowboy who carried a woman across the prairie and never once looked back. And dear listeners, if this tale has ridden into your heart, if you have felt the thunder of hooves and the weight of her plea echo in your chest, then let this not be the end. Subscribe now. Join this journey and ride with us into the next story, because the prairie is vast, the night is long, and the fire of love and survival burns brighter when you carry it with us.